I want to add my welcome to everybody for being here. Thank you for coming out. As Kyle said, this is our seventh, what was first our national conference. It was originally called our national conference, but now it's called our North American Conference in recognition that we bring folks from Canada here and that we're kind of lining up regionally with work in North America, work in Europe, United Kingdom, and Asia Pacific, which includes Australia, with some work in New Zealand, and some work in Hong Kong and Singapore in the last few years. But one of the small notes about this, I mentioned this yesterday, is the first nationwide Safe and Together event happened here in Denver around 2005, 2006. And it was a small, intimate meeting. It was about 2.5 days of training, and it was really the first time we had taken the Safe and Together model out in a public way to really talk about the work and to bring people on board. And we got a tremendous amount of support from Department of Human Services at that point. And in keeping with Kyle's comment about the model and champions and leaders, is at every turn, any place we've been impactful, there's been somebody on the ground who has picked up the call around this and said, this is important, this is something we want to see implemented. This answers a problem we have or an issue that I've been seeing, and that I really want to make a difference, and I want to bring Safe and Together in. And I've always been honored by the fact that we're coming in and there's somebody sponsoring us or a group of people sponsoring us. And in many ways, oftentimes their reputation and their capital, if you know what I mean, is on the line. They kind of say, we need this. And I've always felt very honored and feel like it's really in many ways a trust that's given to us, because we're coming in and training people's staff. We're coming into somebody's home, so to speak. We're coming into your environment. We're coming into your context. And for me, we've always tried to approach that with a tremendous amount of respect and appreciation. And because it's as folks coming in to do consultation, to do training, to do organizational assessment, to provide e-learning, to provide certification of trainers as we've widened out our spectrum of offerings, that we can provide that information, we can provide that guidance, we can provide a framework, we can say this is what's worked in other places, but the truth is, on the ground, it's you and your peers and your colleagues and your administrators and your staff that do that work. And Kyle referenced being a social worker. I was a practitioner for years, and for me, real change, systems change that changes your reality as practitioners, and then obviously change that changes the lives of domestic violence survivors and their kids and families is what this is about for me. When I started doing work with families 30 years ago, that's the level I was working at. I wanted to work with domestic violence perpetrators to help their partners and their kids be safer. Then over time, the work spread out to do training and to do training work. And it was really clear that training wasn't enough. That training was important, it was a critical element of change, but that we'd hear things like workers saying to me, David, this is great. I love the model, I love this approach, but this is not the way my supervisor wants me to practice. And so again, we began to see barriers. And I remember going to somebody who was high up in a child welfare agency in quality assurance, and I had a conversation with him about this, and he said, you know what? What you need to explain to us is how working in this way is going to keep kids safer. And he said something else that was really interesting and will be familiar to some of you and not familiar to other ones of you. He said, you've got to convince us that this will create better outcomes for kids and families. That makes perfect sense. Keep kids safe. And you've got to figure out how this is going to help us save money. And that was really important learning for me as somebody who came up at the practitioner level, who was focused on how do I talk to clients, how do I engage them, what will make a difference. I was getting schooled in systems change and what drives systems change and how administrators need to think, and administrators in the room know what I'm talking about, and that the calculus for everybody is a little bit different from where you're sitting, because if you're a frontline worker, that money equation may not mean as much to you as time. You want a way to help families that's efficient as possible, right? If you're a frontline practitioner, because you're always juggling time commitments. There's always more work than you have time for. And so we really developed the model. So the model, in many ways, a lot of the core and the content of the model has stayed stable. And as Heidi says, the model is stable, and what does Heidi say? The application is infinite. And so what I'm going to focus on in a few minutes in this keynote is an activity that really gets to the heart of the model that has stayed stable for all this time. And I want you to be thinking about what this means for systems and practice change, but really, what does it mean to dive to the heart of the model, that perpetrator pattern-based approach, and apply it in your practice, but to get you to think about what does it mean in terms of being a champion around this issue and really bring this forward. Tomorrow, I'm going to share a little bit of data about the impact our model's been having across the globe. And we just started gathering practice change information. And one of the themes that comes out of that is that people getting trained in our 4-day core training, one of the ways they're feeling effective is that they're sharing this information with their peers and having the opportunity to share with their peers. Because I think people who want to see domestic violence informed practice happen in their agency, they not only want to do that differently in their practice, but they want to know their peers are practicing this way as well. And so for me, this is part of that journey that started with practice work for me, with perpetrators that was focused on survivors, adult and child survivors. This is part of the journey that was here in Colorado maybe almost 15 years ago, and that it's expanded out nationally and internationally. So as Kyle says, I'm really excited to be here and to do this with everybody. If you're not familiar with our organization, this is our mission: to create, nurture, sustain a global network of domestic violence-informed child welfare professionals, communities, and systems. One of the ways that we're doing this is we're added a component to our conferences, starting with this one, where we're asking for nominations. We've done this already for this event, so think to the future. But we ask people to nominate people as a Safe and Together champion and to submit applications. And that means we're looking for people who have applied the model above and beyond, who have really thought about their job and application and have been identified by their peers, a supervisor, manager, colleague, that this person has excelled in applying the Safe and Together model in their work. So I don't know, Kyle, today or tomorrow, I can't remember what it is, at lunchtime we'll be doing, or around one of the sessions, we'll be introducing the person who was selected as the first Safe and Together champion under this award program. Because for us, it's this network of professionals that we're really trying to cultivate. And for those of you who have been involved with us for a while, you may be connected to people in other states who are doing the Safe and Together work, or this may be your first connection. But if it is, you're connected now to people who are going to be meeting in Melbourne, Australia for a conference in February. You know, these are the connections we're trying to build, and to build up the expertise and knowledge that allows systems to better help domestic violence survivors and their kids, to partner with them, to identify their strengths as parents, to intervene with perpetrators as parents to increase outcomes for families. So this is what we're about. And again, to just before we leap into the activity, wanted people to just see that this gives you just a visual representation, and you can see a number of states across the U.S. We're working in Canada and the UK. One of the things we're most proud of the work in the United Kingdom is work with the Ministry of Defense. We've trained up their chaplaincy. Well, we trained certified trainers who are training into their chaplaincy, their medical staff, their military police, and their welfare services to apply the model in their work. And they've done tremendous things. So for instance, they've changed the way their case file names have opened. So instead of opening those case files under survivors' names, that they're all being named under the perpetrator's name, for instance. So not only are they doing training on the model, but they're using that as a jumping off point for systems change. And then we have some work in Asia, Hong Kong. We've done some work in Singapore recently. And Australia is probably our largest overseas work. And we're doing a tremendous amount of certified trainers are doing a tremendous amount of work training people. So for instance, and again, I'll talk about this a little more tomorrow, but certified Safe and Together trainers did 10 core trainings, 40 days of training. Well, they're doing it in this month, in November, all over the globe, with much of that in Australia. If you consider that the average size of those groups is, say, about 30 people, that's 3,000 workers trained. And if you think about the average caseload of a worker, the low conservative number is 10 families. And I know some of you are going to laugh with that number. We have to pull statistics from somewhere, and we're looking at caseload averages. But the cross-sectional cut at that is 10 families, okay? So if we're talking about 30 people, 3,000, I'm going to get the math here correct. 10 times 30 is 300. 3,000 families off of that. And then if you talk about 2 kids on average in every family, that may be 6,000 kids that we're impacting on caseloads right now, not even going forward. And that's just 1 month. So for us, the reach of the model that's jumped in the last couple of years with that program and our e-learning has been tremendous. So just wanted to give you a feel for sort of where we're operating, a little bit how we're operating, and who we are, if we're unfamiliar to you. This session, and we were joking about this earlier, is going to involve more you than me. And I want to prep folks that I'm going to want you, those of you who are sitting alone at a table or at small tables, I'm going to have you move in a few minutes. I'd like to have at least 5 or 6 people at every table. We can get away with 4, but 3 won't be enough. So I'm just kind of previewing for folks who are looking around at the tables that we're going to be doing an activity. You may have to move and get connected. This is not you guys sitting and listening to me. You guys are going to be doing work, and what I'm going to walk you through is a little bit of a boot camp around applying the perpetrator pattern-based approach. That's the heart of the model. I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes, but I really want you to be thinking about this as it's going to lead up to this activity. People talk to me. We often get approached and say, how do we change? How do we get the most bang for a buck? How do we make the difference for families that we want to make on a tight budget and really shift our practice to become what we refer to as more domestic violence informed? And while there are lots of answers I can give and lots of ways I can answer that question, what I always come back to is, if you can't be applying a perpetrator pattern-based approach in the day-to-day work that's being done by your agency, then you're going to have a hard time doing everything else. And that means that decisions around domestic violence are going to be off-kilter. They're not going to be as good as they might be. That you're going to have a harder time partnering with survivors around the safety and well-being of their kids. You're going to have a harder time mapping out how domestic violence perpetrators' behaviors are impacting child and family functioning. You're going to have a harder time making the right decisions about going to court, creating behaviorally based case plans for perpetrators, liaisoning with and communicating with partners in the community. You're going to have a hard time if you're child welfare working with advocates, and advocates are going to have a hard time with you, vice versa. That all these things will be harder without this. And so one of the things I'm going to say is kind of on the back of one of the things that Kyle pointed to is the work is hard enough. The challenges that are being faced by the families we're working with, whether it's poverty, whether it's racism, whether it's other forms of institutional oppression, whether it's violence, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's mental health, whether it's lack of affordable housing, those issues are big enough. Why do we want to make our job harder than it needs to be? And one of the ways I would talk to people about this is about changing your practice. So as much as we're talking about domestic violence in families, the model at its heart is about what you do differently, what I do differently, what we do in our work every day. And that we have complete control over. We have complete control over the words we use to approach a domestic violence survivor when a child welfare report comes in. If we choose to go out and say to her, we're here because your husband and you got into a fight the other day, if that's the language we use when we've gotten a report from the police into child welfare, if that's language we choose to use, instead of using more domestic violence informed language, we're saying to somebody, we're here because we got a report from your police that your partner got arrested for being violent in front of your kids, with you in front of your kids. And we're here because we're concerned about your safety and the safety of your children. Just that kind of change, which is on the back of a perpetrator pattern-based approach, is something that can make all the difference for that survivor, even if she's had negative experiences with child welfare before. You, any of us, we have complete control over that language and that way of approaching that person. If we don't choose to use that language, we've just made our job harder. We've potentially pushed her away from us because we use mutualizing language that suggests we're coming here to assess her and her partner's relationship versus her partner's pattern of behavior. We made it harder for her to trust us, maybe disclose information more about abuse or tell us about her active safety efforts. All those things can get lost by just the simple use of the wrong phrase that we have control over using. So for those of you familiar with the model, those of you who are new to the model, this exercise was really designed for everybody to take this really stripped down boot camp, or the other way to think about it is speed dating, in the sense of people familiar with speed dating is it moves pretty quickly. You're going to be moving pretty quickly through rounds. And that what I want you to do is really be thinking about how you apply this perpetrator pattern-based approach. So I'm going to give you the 3-minute description of that approach. A perpetrator pattern-based approach to assessment, to documentation, to interviewing, to thinking about kids in domestic violence looks like this. It starts with a description of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, which includes coercive control, so not just physical violence, but threats, intimidation, emotional control, financial control, use of kids, and also includes behaviors towards or involving the kids. And one of the gaps we're trying to close with the model is that over here is child maltreatment historically, and over here is domestic violence. And those two fields develop separately. And the truth is that they meet in the behavior of domestic violence perpetrators very frequently. That the same person who's abusing the adult in the household is often abusing and neglecting the child in the household as well. And so a perpetrator pattern-based approach asks the question, what is that pattern of behavior, actions and statements? And what I'm going to say to you is, move past the jargon. Don't get caught in the jargon. You're doing this right if you're describing things like he punched her in the face 3 times versus they got into a fight, or even if the statement is he assaulted her, you're not at the level of detail that might be the most useful. Because an assault doesn't tell you what the kids saw. An assault didn't tell you how horrified the kids were. Saying there was an assault but leaving out the statements may mean he punched her in the face 3 times, but as he was doing it, he was saying, and this is based on real cases, he was saying to the kids, come here and watch me kill your mom. So what you get is a 3rd-degree assault, or it says assault language, but what the family experienced was horror, and the kids experienced the fear of death and psychological torment. Every bit of those things that pushes us away from understanding the reality of the family makes our job harder and makes it hard to connect. So a perpetrator pattern-based approach dives into those specific behaviors and statements as it's directed to the adult survivor, to the kids, to other family members, because it could be directed at a mother-in-law, a friend who tries to help. Could be directed to outside professionals, law enforcement, child welfare, other people. And what's really important to understand is true application of a perpetrator pattern-based approach considers this person's behavior in prior relationships and other settings. We had a case we were working with in Australia where he was a tracker for a gang, which meant it's his job to find people who the gang wanted to find, whether they owed them money, whether they had done something the gang didn't want them to do, whether they were a target. And so imagine being this person's partner and he's abusing you. Isn't the information about his profession, quote unquote, relevant to understanding the entrapment and the fear that she's experiencing? Isn't it relevant to know that he threw his last partner down the stairs while she was pregnant? Isn't it relevant to know that he abandoned his last kids with another partner when you're assessing his parenting? We make mistakes and make our job harder when we look at the relationship as the location for the domestic violence. This is not a couples issue. This is a perpetrator pattern-based issue, much like sex abuse is, child sex abuse. We need to apply that. We need to think about that. We need to be focusing on behaviors. So when you're doing this exercise, one of the jobs of the moderator, one of the jobs for everybody at the table is, if you stray from talking about behaviors, you're not going to have a lot of time. Think about behaviors. What are the behaviors? What are the actions? What are the statements? And what I'm going to say to you is, move past the jargon. Don't get caught in the jargon. You're doing this right if you're describing things like he punched her in the face 3 times versus they got into a fight, or even if the statement is he assaulted her, you're not at the level of detail that might be the most useful. Because an assault doesn't tell you what the kids saw. An assault didn't tell you how horrified the kids were. And If you start talking about a mother's history with other relationships, then you may not be doing the right thing for the exercise. So I'm really going to ask you to keep focused. The second part of this perpetrator pattern-based approach, the foundation of it, is this idea that we want to delineate or describe the impact that person's behavior has had on child and family functioning. This is so much more than did the kids see it or hear it. This is really about how perpetrators' behaviors change the day-to-day functioning of the family. How does this violent behavior, how does this abusive behavior change the lives of the people in this family? So I want you to really understand the stripping away of jargon. I could say child and family functioning, but I could also say change the lives, change the reality, change the decision making. I can't go to the store right now because if I do, this is what he'll do. I can't leave the kids at home with him because if I do, I'm going to come back to a mess. I can't go to work because he shows up at my workplace and threatens my boss. The change in functioning, the change in behavior, the understanding how domestic violence perpetrators change the situation. And Evan Stark, who's written about coercive control, talks about domestic violence and coercive control as a liberty crime, as a human rights crime. And I think it's really important to understand what that means because that domestic violence perpetrators attack safety, physical and emotional. They attack self-determination, choice-making, and they attack people's satisfaction with their lives. If I can't move freely to visit the people I want to meet, my mother, my brother, my sister, my friends, go to work, that's a liberty. That's an attack on my liberty. And so what ends up happening for many of us is what we see is the result in the family of this attack on the liberty. I started drinking because I was so depressed because I was being constrained. Everything I tried to do to make things better, he stopped me, or I couldn't get the help I needed. So I started self-medicating. So what we see is the survivor who's drinking or drugging. We have to have the ability to see past that to the domestic violence and what the perpetrator's doing. So this entire exercise is built on a deep dive into the model to looking at the perpetrator's pattern and what it means for different things like assessing protective capacities, for assessing intersections with domestic violence and substance use and mental health, and what it means for things like intersectionalities, issues of oppression and privilege and vulnerabilities that are structural in people's lives. Okay. So you all should have a piece of paper. And what this is going to involve is a volunteer. First, the main thing, every table needs to have somebody who's willing to talk about a domestic violence case they know well. That's the prerequisite. So what I'd like you to do first, I'm going to walk you through this, and I'm going to kind of walk along with you. So what I'd like you to do is for the folks who are sitting by themselves, and there's folks that are in small groups, is to kind of move. So if you don't mind moving, and then actually I'd like to encourage the Oregon folks. You've got New Mexico folks at the table behind you, so why don't you join them over there if you can? And that might be fun for a lot of reasons. I'm playing a little matchmaking here. The New Mexico folks, the Oregon folks we've been working with for years. And the New Mexico folks, we've been doing major work for them a couple of years, so they may have fun talking to each other. And so then, does everybody have at least 4 people at their table? Okay. Anybody short 4 people? Less than 4 people. Okay. The next thing you've got to do is, and don't feel shy to move around. This is not high school or junior high school. This is not some comment on whether people like you or not. Move around, meet new people. And so the next thing you want to do is take a few minutes, introduce yourselves, but then find a volunteer or identify a volunteer or pick a volunteer. So we're kind of moving out of the volunteer part at this point. To somebody who's willing to talk about a case in a de-identified way. That's all I want to do right now. So you have 3 or 4 minutes to kind of introduce yourselves and find the person who's going to talk about the case. So go to that first, and I'll bring you back together. Okay, raise your hand if you haven't identified somebody at your table to talk about a case. If you have not, raise your hand at your table. Has everybody identified a person who's willing to talk about their case? Okay. All right. So I'm going to just keep this moving. And you may not have finished all the introductions, but part of it is if you've ever done speed dating. I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands to identify who did speed dating. But if you've ever done it, you know there's really there's a lot of forward momentum in the process. And so you're going to want to also identify really quickly, and this is a 30-second thing, a moderator. And the moderator's job, this is the person who likes saying, hey, we got off task. That's the person you want to identify as the moderator. Hey, bring it back to behaviors, or bring it back to this specific topic, because each round will have a topic. So pick a moderator or volunteer as a moderator, okay? That's a real job. You need somebody at each table whose job is to say, let's refocus. And then you also want a note taker. So that'd be nice. That's a more introvert-oriented sort of position. The extrovert position is the moderator, okay? So please be doing that. Okay. And so what's going to happen is that I am going to keep time up here to keep the energy going, all right? And if you've looked at this already, because I know it was on the table for a while, what your job is to do is to follow the round instructions on this paper as much as possible. So what's going to happen is the first round is 3 minutes. And what this is that it's the person who's presenting the case to talk about how they came in contact in the case, and the family constellation, what's the organization of the family, how many people, ages, gender, sexual orientation, whatever, in terms of things that will help people understand race, ethnicity, anything that will give people a connection to the family. But what I don't want you to do, you'll notice it's the shortest round, is because oftentimes one of the biggest mistakes that gets made in applying this model starts with initial presentation. Because the rest of you don't know this family. And so imagine if I say, well, it's the Jones family, it's mom and dad, mom's 35, dad's 34, they have 3 kids, these are the ages, boys, girls, their mom is white, dad is African American, they live in this area, this is their job, and the couple has a history of domestic violence. All of a sudden, now we have to actually spend time unwinding that one statement. Do you understand what I'm saying? That if we jump right into, or we start talking about, well, this is a family that we know, and mom's had multiple child welfare involvements, and she was, has a substance issue, and the last time she came in is because she was drinking with the kids in the car. Now, all of a sudden, the first level of information, that precious time, remember I talked about time being important? Now it's been taken up with telling a story about mom, which may be relevant, but from the point of view of focusing and applying and learning to use your domestic violence-informed muscles, so to speak, that's not where we want to go. We want to jump in with the second round immediately with the behaviors. So I'm going to start in 10 seconds, the timer, to start the first round, which is that person just gives basic background on the family for 3 minutes or up to 3 minutes, and then I'll keep you moving, okay? So that's where you are. So round 1, initial presentation round, go for it. Okay, so stop this round. So this round is over. The next round is the behavior round. And what this is specific questions about the perpetrator's pattern of behavior with the immediate family. So this is about partner and kids in this immediate family. If you happen to have a case where there's an idea or question about there being 2 perpetrators, so this is even advanced work, you're going to have to split your time between each person individually. Okay, the way you apply the model in this kind of scenario where there's 2 people is you actually don't talk about the couple's history of violence or the family's history of violence. You still look at each person's individually. So if you picked a case where there's 2 alleged perpetrators, you made your job a lot harder for this morning, just saying. Okay, but I just wanted to make sure that was out there, that people got to really apply the model in a meaningful way. So this is all about behaviors and statements, patterns of behavior of the perpetrator around coercive control and actions taken to harm the kids in this scenario. 5 minutes, go. Okay, wind down this round. You may not feel complete, but this is about practicing and moving through the model. And the next round is going to be about the perpetrator's wider pattern of behavior. Here we're looking at past abuse or control towards past partners, towards kids they have with other partners, and outside the family. Do they get into fights with, they assault neighbors? Have they resisted arrest and been violent with law enforcement? Now, this is not status, and this is really different. Some people will want to say, well, he's a police officer, he's got military training. That's not what we're talking about. Those can be relevant issues, but here we're still focusing on behaviors. What do we know? And what can be useful as a technique is to ask, when somebody says, well, he was physically violent to his last girlfriend, the next question, what do we know about that specifically? What did he do? Ask the next question. You can also ask this question, which is, what else do we know about his wider pattern? What else do we know? A lot of times we'll start talking about these issues, and we'll keep talking about one incident. And part of what I want you to see if you can gather the most information possible right now about the wider pattern. So if you notice you're kind of going in detail, maybe step back and say, what else do we know? Has he been assaultive to somebody else? Has he done this to his kid? So see what you can do to work with this wider pattern. So again, you have 5 minutes, go. Okay, wind down this round. Again, it may feel complete or there's more to talk about. This is about practice, keeping focused on particular areas. Again, the model breaks down into all these parts. And so the next one is intersections. And in the Safe and Together lexicon, intersections refers to the connections between mental health, substance use, and domestic violence primarily, but also can include the intersection of domestic violence with housing and other issues. And so, as everybody in this room knows, that many of the families we're working with, that there's often the presence in some family members of mental health and substance use issues, as well as the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior. A lot of that practice has been siloed. We make lists. There's a history of substance use, mental health, and domestic violence issues in this family. That lets the perpetrator off the hook for their responsibility and doesn't give us that deep dive understanding of the connections or the intersections between those issues. So this round is about how does the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior intersect with their own substance use and mental health issues, or intersect with other family members' issues around substance use and mental health. So for instance, does he force her to do drugs with him in order to not assault her? Does he sabotage her recovery efforts? Those are examples. Does he use violence and control to get money for drugs? So what we're going to do is dive into the pattern of behavior of the perpetrator around these intersections, okay? And you've got some prompts there for you. So go. This is next round, 5 minutes. Okay. I know this may feel fast. Wind down this conversation, and we're going to move to the next round. We're going to keep things moving. The next round is intersectionalities, and where we're talking about privilege, issues of oppression, vulnerabilities that are systematic. In the Safe and Together model, for those of you familiar with it, it's that fifth critical component that captures a lot of things that may not be causal, but are really relevant. And so it's really important to remember that domestic violence isn't caused by these issues of intersectionality, but we can't ignore them. And that we really want to be thinking about who's vulnerable and why. So if somebody has a disability and the victim has a disability or a medical condition that's not being treated, is status of the perpetrator, do they have financial status? Do they have position in their community status? Is somebody vulnerable because of their immigration status? And that actually can cut a lot of different ways, because if my partner who's abusing me is not documented, I may not want to call the police on them because I want them to stop, but I don't want them deported. So I really want people to think really widely about these things. We're working with families in Australia where one of them, the victim may be Indigenous and the perpetrator may be non-Indigenous. So he's got more status as being white in society. So I really want you to think about these different pieces as it relates to this particular family. What issues of oppression, privilege, status might be going on and giving the perpetrator more leverage, making the survivor more vulnerable, increasing the entrapment, increasing the impact on family functioning, all of that. So again, here's some prompts that you have here. And so another 5-minute round. So go for it. Okay. So this is, wrap this up. And again, these are large topics, and part of what I'm trying to let you see is with focused conversations how much you can get done. Because again, time is a premium for many of us. So this is the last round we're going to have you do in small groups. And I'm going to have you do it a little bit differently, which is what I'd like you to do is identify 5 things. I'm going to keep it very tight. Based on these earlier rounds, what are the top 5 impacts on child and family functioning has this perpetrator had? Okay, what's the top 5? What's the top most important ones? Another way to think about it, what is most different about this family because of the perpetrator's behavior? Another way to think about it is what's weaker about the family? How is the family weaker in their functioning? And you can think about the overall family. You know, they lost housing for 6 out of the last 12 months, you know, because of their behavior. Whatever that looks like. So hone in on the impact, and you've got some prompts: safety and trauma, family ecology, survivors parenting. But do the top 5, and I'll kind of stop you probably a couple minutes early, just really get them out there, right? So go with this last round, the impact round. Okay, why don't you wind down this conversation? And we're not going to do the last round in small groups. We're going to do a large group debrief, the implications round. But what I'd like you to do before we kind of switch into the large group is thank the person who shared their case. You know, thank you for doing that. And thank your table mates for having such a great conversation. And so we've got 2 folks around with microphones. We've got Kyle, I think, on that side, Brittany over there. So I'm going to just ask a couple of large group debrief questions. And the first one is just, what did you learn from doing this kind of deep dive, speed dating, boot camp approach to looking at perpetrator patterns? So raise your hand. What did you learn? What stands out from you in doing this way? Maybe new to you. Oh, there's Chris over there.
I thought it was really helpful because it just really forced us to focus on his behaviors, how it's affecting the family, and then move through step by step. I thought it was really helpful.
Was that hard to do, to keep that focus, or was it easy with the kind of guidance?
I mean, it was easy with your guidance, but it was hard for me because we haven't always done our case consults like that. We kind of get meshed with all the other stuff right away, and so it was nice to just boom, 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 focus on that, and you really get to the point.
Great, okay. Somebody else, what did you learn? What was most important for you? Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing too, David, is you hear in the field, we don't have time, we got too many cases, the cases are too big. I think that just this, doing this activity together proves it doesn't take take tons and tons of time to really sit down and walk through the steps on a case for DV. It doesn't. You can do that, and it's workable, and we just proved it.
That's right. So time is of the essence. Over there, somebody over there. Great.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about how helpful it was to have all of our brains working together.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things I just want to say about this is having lots of people in the room with bad thinking doesn't lead to better outcomes. Having lots of people in the room with guidance and direction can lead to better outcomes. Do you understand what I'm saying? So what happens is if you don't have this, team meetings actually can just reinforce the negative DV destructive thinking. So again, lots of people with the right focus can make a big difference. What else did people learn? There in the middle. Oh, it's going to be a race between, Brittany won.
As we were hearing it, I was just thinking we were already talking about it from the perception of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, but I was just thinking how complex our case was, of how difficult it would be for a caseworker who wasn't starting at it from the standpoint we are, from being here and already
Right.
knowing about the Safe
Right.
and Together model because of how complex our case was. To be taking that on and only thinking about it from what you may learn about domestic violence, would be almost impossible to try
Right.
to navigate through how complex our case.
But did
actually
this help
was.
you with a complex case?
Yeah, yeah.
Together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I want people to hear, thank you, is understanding that there's different levels of practice around the model. This is why we could do this activity with people who are more experienced with the model and people who are new, because still the behavioral focus is really very simple in some sense. If you want to practice this and you're talking to a colleague and you're sitting in a meeting and they say, oh, this family has domestic violence in it, all you need to say is, can you tell me a little bit of what that looks like? And if they tell you about the arrest history, say, okay, given those arrests, can you describe what the perpetrator did in the police reports? As long as you're listening with a behavioral ear, at least for the foundational bit, then you'll know when you're hearing jargon and you're hearing words that don't tell you, what did he do? What did he say? What did that look like? How did he do that? Those are all the questions that you use. So anybody can use those immediately to kind of up the ante. And you're right, there are more complex cases, there are more complex issues that you need more experience with. And for those of you who are getting a good taste of this here, Heidi's doing a whole perpetrator pattern-based mapping tool workshop tomorrow. So that's another way to really dive in this, and it's actually a tool that you can hand out and give people. So it's a written piece of guidance as well. So I would encourage people to attend that tomorrow. What else did you learn? What else are you taking away from this activity? Over there again, kind of center. Wait for them. Just let the microphone.
As we talked and asked questions, there were behaviors that were talked about that originally we didn't see them as a coercive pattern of control.
Right.
And then we really recognized, oh, wow, that is control and that's coercive. I mean, really recognizing how certain things are patterns that we hadn't seen before.
Right. Okay, great. So when you use that lens and you apply it vigorously, some things take on a different set of meaning before, including things that look nice. He showed up to all the visits with the doctors. He was always there when we came to the house. Those things could be perceived as, oh, he's deeply involved. But when you take the lens back a little bit and go, wait a second, he's always there. And in fact, I made the appointment with mom, and he's there. How does he know? Why is he there? What would the conversation look differently if he wasn't in the room? And then all of a sudden, what seems benevolent is about monitoring, is about checking up. So that's an example I could think about with that.
One of the things we talked about is that we realized the things that we didn't know from this exercise.
Right. Thank you. And in a fuller, and I think in the mapping tool and other places, and when we do consultations around this, that you'd kind of create a parking area for the unknowns, and at the end you'd sift through them and say, okay, half of this stuff would be nice to know, but we might not be able to know it. But 2 or 3 of these things, like what was the level of violence he applied in his last relationship? I think we need to know that. And so you can really triage the unknowns and decide what's the most important thing to pursue or to help you understand. Like, for instance, if you have somebody, a victim who's going to get substance recovery, and you didn't know about his pattern of how he interacted with her around her recovery efforts, I would say that's a must-know. Because if you refer her to recovery efforts and you don't understand his pattern of control around that, then you're maybe wasting her time, your agency's money, and decreasing the likelihood that she's going to be successful. And to me, that would be a critical issue. 1 or 2 more people, like takeaways right there in the center.
I think this may have already been said, but I just want to emphasize it again. What I think we realize is without this very intentional focus on his behavior,
Right.
it is very easy to drift back to her and her feelings and her responses and to gloss over very specific things he did,
Right.
to talk about them
Right.
in broad terms rather than the very behaviorally specific terms that
That's right.
forcing us to come back to this.
That's right.
And
there's tremendous amount of, what I'll say is, to be fair to everybody, tremendous amount of institutional and cultural forces we are fighting against to make this happen. And why the model is very specific and focused is because We're working against gender double standards, which are going to direct people to focus more on mothers' decision making in a lot of cases. We're working against comfort and familiarity, where people are often much more comfortable working with women. We're working against lack of training around working with men. We're working around tools and systems that were primarily focused on women, poor women, women of color, are really working on this, so this idea of unwinding these things. And the model was specifically designed to give people tools to unwind them in an efficient, direct, clear way that can be bottom lined. Anybody who's working as an advocate, not working as child welfare, want to comment on what they took away from this? That's you. I didn't ask people to identify sort of, so their organization and their name, but if somebody wants to speak specifically from that lens, yeah.
Okay, so I'm with a domestic violence agency.
Yep.
So I think what was really wow for me was understanding the impact it had on the children, his behavior.
Right.
Had on the children, because
Right.
these children are now adults,
Right.
or near adults. They're
Right.
teenagers. And we looked at the family as a whole and the individuals in the family.
Right.
There was 20 years of no intervention.
Right.
And the damage
Right.
was done.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry, these are the gaps we're trying to close. Did you want to add something to
I
that?
just wanted to add something. I thought this was excellent. I think it will have incredible impact on my team members
Right.
when they are working with survivors just coming in order to really get an understanding of where the survivor is in that moment, by first sort of working with the survivor to understand what has happened to them,
Right.
the perpetrator's pattern
Right.
of, and we'll be implementing this in
Good.
our agency, because I
Good.
just think it's
There's
incredible.
two more. There's a couple hands there, and I'm gonna have to move to wrapping up. So right behind you, I know there's that one hand, Cheryl, or is it two?
So the spoilers that we're actually going to be talking about applying these tools to advocacy in one of the breakout sessions after
Yeah.
this. But something that I think is really important
Right.
is not only do these tools actually help advocates safety plan,
Right.
helps child welfare and advocates understand what the barriers are to safety, but also sometimes for, I think, child welfare, when they look at advocates, it's like you're so focused on that parent. What about child safety? But if you look at what the perpetrator's doing, how that affects the children's access to the
Right.
safe parent,
That's
by
right.
supporting them as an advocate, you're actually facilitating child safety because you're giving them their parent back.
That's right. That's a great way to put it. And really, you'll hear woven through your workshop, the panel this afternoon. We're talking about roles of advocates or subject matter experts in this and shifting systems. So to wrap this up, just here is sort of a summary. When we think about perpetrator pattern-based approach, these are some of the key things we were working with: that the perpetrator is the source of the harm, that perpetration is a parenting choice. To really think through that lens, if we want to hold perpetrators accountable, we need to focus on behaviors and its impact on child and family functioning. Focus on the perpetrator, not on the relationship. So much of the work ends up being around people thinking, if I identify the relationship issues, I'm dealing with domestic violence. Or if I identify where he's living or not living, that's going to tell me something about safety, and that's not true. Identify the full range of targets: kids, current relationship, partner, current relationship, past partners, kids, other people outside the relationship. Who has he targeted in what way? Past and present, not just now, but what he's done in the past. It's wrong to miss out on his prior behavior, and then it's so important to really make these connections around intersections and intersectionalities. And then hopefully people can see this is why does this matter? And a lot of us know this is because it's serious and prevalent. It's required if you want to be DV informed as an agency, increases perpetrator accountability, better decisions, reduces gender and privilege bias, provides us shared language that you were just talking about between systems that's so important, and helps unravel the relationship between domestic violence, substance use, and mental health. And that leads to these outcomes: better practice, better collaboration, better outcomes for families. And that, where are we applying this? And just so people have an idea, this was a deep dive into sort of the guts of how to apply this, and that this approach is throughout the Safe and Together model suite of tools. And Heidi's going to be doing the mapping tool tomorrow, but it shows up our multiple pathways to harm, e-learning, and other courses, and all these different ways, including advocacy work, training we do for survivors, organizational assessment. It's kind of the engine of so much of the model, along with survivors' protective capacities and partnering with survivors. So this is so much of what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.